Perfect. So today we have the great pleasure of listening to Barry Maguire, who will be discussing socialism and the collective ownership of the means of production, which is a joint work with Jan Kandiyali. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing correctly. Apologies. Barry Maguire is a professor of moral and political philosophy at the University of Edinburgh. He previously held academic positions at Stanford University, the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and New York University. And his main research project is the development of an ethical theory based on an ideal of caring solidarity. This approach aims to integrate standards of justification in the ethics of economics, political philosophy, and moral philosophy. We are very happy to have you here today. Thank you, Barry. You have up to 45 minutes for your presentation. And we'll also, Caleb very kindly added on the chat the handout for today's presentation. Thanks, Caleb. So, Barry, 40 to 45 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katharina. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks to you and Caleb and everyone at the Visions for a Future project for inviting me. It's a terrific project. I'm really excited that you're doing it. I'm looking forward to seeing more of the fruits of the project, and it's just great to be with friends and thinking creatively about better visions for the future. There's so much great kind of lefty political economy and political philosophy in the Netherlands. It's I'm both kind of excited and nervous to talk with you. This is a work in progress with Jan Kandiyali. Apart from a pub philosophy event that we did that was excellent and challenging, I don't think we've given this work yet as a talk. Maybe Jan has. So we're really excited to see what kind of responses people might have to this project, and this is in some sense early work in progress, and there's a long way to go in thinking through some of these issues. So very, very grateful for all of you for being here, and for any thoughts you might have. As Katharina mentioned, this is also, or implied, maybe this is also related to some work of mine, and I've got a book project that develops this kind of idea of caring solidarity and at more length. So some of this is joint work and some of it is not, and that made pronouns tricky, and so I've opted for a chaotic combination of we and I in the talk to follow. But bear with me. I obviously take all the blame for the mistakes, and all the good stuff comes from Jan. So historically, socialism has been identified with collective control and ownership of the means of production. So, for example, here's Eugene Debs in 1918. I believe, he said, as all socialists do, that all things that are jointly needed and used ought to be jointly owned. Or here's G.D.H. Cole in his mid-century history of socialist thought, kind of right on the money. Socialism, as the word was first used, meant collective regulation of men's affairs on a cooperative basis. Some theorists, especially in the early 20th century, with the calculation debates, opted for a particularly strong version of this relationship, simply identifying socialism with collective ownership of the means of production. So call this strong view ownership fundamentalism, and that's the first note on the handout that I think Caleb kindly dropped in the chat. To many, it seems that this view is too strong, and we think rightly, ownership structures tell us who's permitted to use and transfer resources. It hardly seems plausible that collective ownership is the only thing that socialists should most fundamentally value. To identify socialism exclusively with collective ownership of the means of production is to fetishize ownership, we think. A second view of what socialism is emerges from the purported failures of central command economics and influential arguments about the necessity of markets for organizing production in complex, large-scale societies. In an attempt to rescue socialism from what they perceive to be discredited economics, these kind of late 20th century socialists identify socialism with a set of values, usually some demanding form of equality of opportunity, and then argue that the question as to what economic arrangement realizes those values is a separate matter. A good statement of the sort of view we have in mind, that I'm sure is familiar to you all, is provided by John Romer in A Future for Socialism. He says, the goal of socialism is best thought of as a kind of egalitarianism, not the implementation of a specific property relation. In Romer's view, socialism should be identified with a value, in his case, a version of egalitarianism, where this value is not tied to any particular form of property relationship. On this view, it's an open question as to whether socialism calls for collective ownership or something different altogether. As Romer says, socialists should advocate those property relations and productive assets that will bring about a society that ranks highest according to the preferences over the relevant kinds of equality, in his case. One cannot say at this point in history that one knows what those property rights must be. Call this approach ownership instrumentalism. While this move away from ownership is understandable, we think it's a mistake. We think the baby's been thrown out with the bathwater. If socialism is identified with equality and the question as to what realizes equality is left open, then socialism is indistinguishable from liberal egalitarianism. Far from showing a future for socialism, the separation of axiology from economics threatens to show that socialism is all but dead, apart from a residual commitment to egalitarianism shared with other traditions. We aim to articulate and partially defend an alternative to ownership fundamentalism and ownership instrumentalism. In our view, the heart of socialism is a thick relational ideal that involves, but is not reducible just to, an economic and juridical structure describable as the collective ownership of the means of production. So our argument that I'll present here has three main steps. First, we argue that the heart of socialism is an ideal of caring solidarity. The ideal of caring solidarity enjoins us to engage in the shared activity of caring about one another, or in other words, to do what we can to meet one another's needs collaboratively, together. Second, we argue that caring solidarity constitutively involves collective planning of the means of production, and that planning is possible only if there's collective control of those means. And then third, we argue that this collective control is incompatible with private ownership of the means of production, but instead would constitutively involve collective ownership. Hence, socialism as caring solidarity would constitutively involve the collective ownership of the means of production. Then in closing, I'll reply to two fairly obvious objections or worries about this kind of view, that some version of the ideal is compatible with market socialism, perhaps, or that this is merely romantic anti-capitalism, as David Miller put it, ill-suited to complex global economics. Before proceeding, just a quick clarification about what I'm going to argue for the next 40 minutes or so. What follows isn't a decisive case either for socialism as caring solidarity, nor that socialism as caring solidarity is the correct moral standard of political economy and other domains of social life. I think both of these claims are true, but the argument today is just that socialism so considered constitutively involves collective planning of the means of production and would involve collective control and ownership of the means of production. So the argument sort of from this attractive model of socialism to collective ownership of the means of production. Okay. So this is section 2 on your handout, care solidarity and caring solidarity. Just realised I forgot to include any jokes in this talk. Really sorry about that. No jokes. Not a single time. It's not a single joke. I'll try and improvise in the Q&A, but until then, it's going to be really boring. So, start with the famous Marxist slogan, from each according to their abilities to each according to their needs. Many contemporary theorists have been tempted to factorize this into two distributive principles, respectively specifying responsibilities and entitlements, making room for a market system to intermediate between them. But on an alternative interpretation, this slogan articulates an intentional relationship between agents, one in which agents together do what they can to meet relevant needs as participants in larger shared activities of meeting one another's needs. I propose to render this relationship as a certain combination of care and solidarity. This approach emphasizes our positive responsibilities together and to one another, rather than simply criticizing various negative aspects of capitalism. That's another attraction. So, first on care. It's widely heard that caring about someone involves doing what you can to meet their needs. More specifically, we can say that care involves being robustly and intrinsically motivated to do what one can to recognizably meet some particular needs. This, I think, is a deep and underappreciated point of connection between care ethics and socialist ethics. In being intrinsically motivated, one's motivated to meet the need for its own sake, not merely as a means to something else, such as meeting one's own need to meet the need, though one might be motivated by that too. This ideal of intrinsic motivation is compatible with denying that one sees others merely as an end, for one sees them rather as an end with ends, as a fellow participant in socialist community. This motivation is also robust since it's not conditional on other things that one wants necessarily. One's particular motivation is not, however, thereby unconditional, given the possibility of conflicts with other specific socialized commitments. In addition to being intrinsically motivated by needs, one's also attentive to the relevant needs. This is something that's been emphasized a lot in the care ethics literature. Caring about someone involves really listening to them and taking their own views about their needs seriously. This kind of humble responsiveness to the other and openness to the other constitutes what we'll call agent respect. To that extent, care is a weakly collaborative activity, but I think too weak, because care still usually involves a clear self-other distinction. One person caring about another is an asymmetric relationship, as is perhaps clear from the paradigmatic caring relationship, namely a parent caring for a child. This asymmetry is consistent with agent respect, because A might care about B respectfully, even though B doesn't care about A. The one cared about may willingly volunteer authentic information about their needs, and they might accept assistance, there might be uptake, but they might not otherwise facilitate their being cared for, and they may not care at all about the other. So that kind of asymmetry of care, I think, ill fits it to be the sole basis for an ideal moral relationship. So at this point, I want to draw on the account of solidarity, in particular the account of solidarity as a shared activity developed by Andrea Sangiovanni. On this account, and the specifics here are on the handout if anyone wants to read along. On this account, we act in solidarity when, as a result of identifying with one another, we each intend to participate to overcome some significant adversity by pursuing a shared end together. And we're individually committed to relevant ends and means and not bypassing each other's will in pursuing them, a kind of meshing subplans condition. We're committed to sharing our fate in relevant ways. It's a kind of condition of will, and we trust one another to meet all of these conditions. So solidarity is a kind of robust shared activity with identification with one another on the basis of common need, a joint project together where we're sort of all committed to participating in it and trust one another as such. This approach involves starting with a we perspective and consequently seeing one's own responsibilities as a way to participate in a larger collaborative enterprise in which one trusts others to uphold their responsibilities similarly in turn. I think this draws on an important tradition in socialist thought, the idea of being together in the social struggle. This idea of sharing a struggle as distinct from suffering common hardships, I think has been somewhat neglected by liberal egalitarianism. But now a limitation of solidarity. The end of solidarity activity can be just about anything, given this kind of formula. There can be solidarity amongst mafia members, thieves, and so on. By contrast, the socialist ideal is a relationship in which I think agents care about one another, i.e. in which they are doing what they can together to meet one another's needs. So I think we need a model in which the end of solidarity activity is not merely something external, like building a dam against rising sea levels or repelling an alien force from a village. It's rather something internal. It's a kind of activity. The end, the thing that we have in common in solidarity, is a certain kind of activity, namely a kind of activity that sustains a certain way of living together. So I suggest that caring about one another is exactly the relevant end of solidarity activity. And so the proposal is that in the socialist ideal, we have solidarity in mutual care, or for short, caring solidarity. So that's the kind of ideal. In the book, I argue that this relation is kind of impersonal and constitutes a kind of attractive ideal in interpersonal context, political context, economic context, and a range of scales. And so it has this kind of quality of being fractal, where whatever degree of resolution you look at in society, or whatever kind of relationship you look at in society, it can be structured as kind of as caring solidarity, as a kind of joint project of meeting one another's needs together, bearing in mind those needs might otherwise be incredibly heterogeneous. Okay, so the vital need. To care about someone is to do what one can to meet their needs. The socialist ideal involves a more expansive conception of caring about one another. Importantly, we don't assume, unlike some people in the caring ethics tradition, that care is only responsive to basic needs or bodily needs or some kind of narrow conception of biological needs. Rather, I assume that our needs are the conditions that must be met in order for us to flourish. Our needs can be quite expansive, corresponding to the broad range of activities that can constitute our flourishing. These can, for example, include needs associated with a range of aesthetic, intellectual, and creative ideals. So we have lots of needs. Some of them are purely personal. Perhaps you need an unusual amount of alone time or exercise or variation in your diet. Some of our needs involve meeting the needs of others. For instance, cooking food to share with friends or playing the trumpet well, I suppose. So far, this has all been rather formal, but now I want to introduce a kind of substantive claim, namely that we have a need to live in caring solidarity with others. This is a need to meet the needs of others, as participants in larger collaborations doing the same. So with a nod towards the early Marx, we call this the vital need. We think the vital need is common, and would be even more so in an economic and ideological system that supported rather than inhibited it. But while there's some empirical evidence for the vital needs, we don't put it forward as an empirical conjecture. It's more like a normative expectation. In caring solidarity, we assume that others have a need to meet needs. This is what moral respect consists in on this approach. So this idea of moral respect is distinct from agent respect introduced earlier, which is a matter of openness to others. Moral respect is sort of normative expectations of this need to participate in relations of caring solidarity. Consequently, caring about someone is not merely a matter of meeting their consumption needs narrowly conceived, but also of putting them in the position where they can meet the needs of others. The vital need has an important implication for our argument. Since the needs is presumed to be shared by all, it follows the A's act of putting B in a position where they can meet C's needs is itself an activity of A's caring about B, and perhaps also about C, and perhaps also about A. So A's putting B in a position where B can meet C's needs is itself an activity of A's caring about B, and perhaps also about C, and perhaps also about A. Okay, so that's caring solidarity. Let me move on to what is section 3 on the handout. From caring solidarity to collective control. And then the next section will move from collective control to collective ownership. Let's start with a rather obvious point about care. Sometimes we do what we can to meet the needs of others, but fail to meet those needs because we lack the resources to do so successfully. So here, just to have a little bit of language for this, we distinguish latent care from care, where there's latent care when the kind of general motivational conditions of care are met, but without what's materially or socially needed to care. For example, with the best will in the world, a doctor nowadays can't care for their patients without required technology and support from other healthcare professionals, among others. Footnote. We're having a kind of funding, an artificially created funding crisis at University of Edinburgh, and a lot of people's jobs are being shrunk, or they're being given more work, and some people are being laid off. There's voluntary severance, there's all sorts of problems. And effectively, one of the implications of this is that janitorial staff are doing loads of extra hours, and no one's really recognizing this. And so the janitorial staff that have been working at University of Edinburgh for like 25 years, who are coming into work at 6 o'clock in the morning for an 8 o'clock in the morning shift, for which they're not getting paid a lot of money, because otherwise, as a matter of fact, no one would open the buildings, none of the lights would be on. So, you know, to teach students, you know, you need a certain amount of infrastructure. For one thing, you need people to come and open up the buildings that you're going to be teaching the classes in. So there's like there's a lot of background infrastructure. Okay, so there's various ways in which individuals can come to have whatever they need to care about others. For instance, I might get the resources I need to care about you by threat or force, or by distribution from an all-powerful despot, or by manna from heaven. In these cases, I can care for you, but the transfer of resources itself doesn't constitute a form of care. In fact, some ways of transferring resources may seem distinctively uncaring. However, contrast these cases with cases where what one needs to care about others is intentionally provided to one for that very purpose. And you might think the janitors coming in at 6 in the morning are motivated by the value of teaching, for example, among other educationally related values. This leads us to the following definition: empowerment. To empower someone to care about someone with relevant needs is to intentionally put them in a position such that if they care latently about meeting those needs and their suitable uptake, then they're able to meet those needs. This should also be on the handout. So a fairly intuitive idea. Let me just mention 2 important aspects of empowering others. That empowerment is intentional and teleological. So firstly, empowerment is teleological. Empowerment is for a specific end, namely to care about someone's specific needs. So the crucial contrast here in contemporary political philosophy is with provisioning resources for discretionary use, such as Rawlsian primary goods. Rawlsian primary goods are all-purpose means to pursue reasonable ends that individuals elect by exercising their own discretion in isolation. By contrast, empowerments are need-specific. Training someone as a doctor empowers them, likewise giving someone paternity leave, likewise giving someone access to a JCB or a library or a school kitchen. Unlike primary goods or a teaching room, empowerments are teleological, with the ends in question corresponding to needs presumed to be more finely grained than just whatever you reasonably take an interest in. Secondly, relatedly, empowerment is an intentional process. This intentionality is constitutive of both care and solidarity. So your sort of empowerment happens intentionally. It's not merely a coincidence that someone's put in a position to meet the needs with the relevant resources that they need. This intentionality is part of both care and solidarity, and hence it's part of caring solidarity. It's constitutive of care, given the importance of being directly motivated by a need, attentive to those with needs and respectful of their take. And it's constitutive of solidarity, given the identification condition, the shared activity condition, the shared fates conditions. One implication of this intentionality is that there's an important loss when the distributing mechanism, the mechanism distributing resources that people need to, the resources that people need, there's an important loss when that distributing mechanism operates invisibly, as the market famously does. Okay, so care is not a property of action in isolation, but it's a sustained mode of engagement with others. This requires not merely one-off intentions, but plans. To manifest care in serving someone, certain counterfactuals need to be true. Had things been a little bit different this way or that, one would still have served them, one would still have met their need. These counterfactuals are explained by the constitutive role of planning and care. Caring, I think, constitutively involves planning. A planned state is a commitment to certain activities in the future. Some are for simple individual, imminent actions, such as to read the paper in a train. Some are for complex shared activities extended into the future. For instance, planning to establish an interdisciplinary global research network, studying alternative models of ownership. Plans help to control future action and possible contingencies. They help to coordinate behavior with others, and they settle what to do in cases of competing considerations. In addition to these functions, two additional features of plans are worth making explicit here. First, planning yields a valuable kind of social stability. Bratman said that to be stable in part is to resist reconsideration, and that's a kind of constitutive feature of the functional role of plans. Given the prospect of dense, dynamic, and variably scaled plans, collectively planning will progressively and transparently yield social structures that are increasingly stable. So there's a kind of prospect for stability here. The stability also comes from the fact that plans facilitate and coordinate mutual reliance and trust. The ideal of creating solidarity involves mutual trust through the aspect of solidarity, but also, I guess in the first instance, through solidarity. One sees others as fellow participants, and one acts on the basis of normative rather than merely descriptive expectations about their behavior. This in turn involves and sustains relationships of trust within a community. Secondly, plans are layered and scalable. We plan plans that fit other plans. We plan to increase teaching and research in the humanities, so we plan to hire more humanities scholars, so we plan to establish a committee with suitable hiring procedures and so on. Likewise, the plan to boost the humanities might be related to this larger plan to increase democratic engagement across society. This in turn might be part of a larger plan to live in caring solidarity with one another. So a further advantage of transparent participation in a kind of dense, scalable, multi-centered approach that was based on care and is built up through plans concerns mutual recognition. People can see themselves and one another as actively contributing to actual and increasingly dense networks of shared concerns, and ultimately to sustaining a socialist society. This ideal of recognition, or what the early Marx called completion, is another point of connection with the socialist tradition, and also fits with the idea of socialism as a kind of progressive struggle towards greater realization of the ideal. Okay, so far I've kind of sketched a link between caring solidarity and planning and collective planning of the. I'll say a little bit more about means of production in a minute. I'm now just going to turn to the link between collective planning and collective control of what would be the means of production. So now between planning and control. Most actions have material enablers. You can't swim without water, build without bricks, play the trumpet without a trumpet. This is also true, as we saw earlier, of care. Without the relevant equipment and support, doctors can only latently care for their patients. To care, they must have the relevant material enablers and social enablers. To be empowered, we've said, is to be intentionally provided with those enablers to care. Now, planning to do something is possible only if the planner controls the relevant enablers. By control, we just mean whatever use of those enablers is required for them to enable the relevant activity. In the case of swimming, that means access to suitable water, though not to remove much of it. In the case of building, that means access to and power to manipulate all the relevant building materials, though not to destroy them. In the case of music making, that might mean access to a trumpet, though you may not get to take it home. To see why planning is only possible if one controls the relevant enablers, consider some contrasting examples. Suppose I'm building you a house, but brick access is decided by a randomizing device. Then I can't plan to build tomorrow. At most, I can plan conditionally to build if I get bricks. Likewise, suppose you own the bricks and I need to ask you for them tomorrow. I don't know, you'll say yes, so at most I can plan conditionally to build if you grant them to me. In these cases, my ability to formulate and execute a plan to build a house is compromised by my lack of control over the bricks. But conditional planning isn't planning. I can conditionally plan to build a garden on the moon. Effectively planning to distribute means of production in accordance with need is possible only with control over the means of production. It may be objected that technically I can plan to swim, build, or practice medicine without having access to water, bricks, or medical equipment if I falsely believe I have such access. This is because planning is a psychological state, whereas control concerns one's de facto power, in this case over productive resources. However, in the case of false beliefs, my plans will come to nothing, they'll be ineffective. To plan effectively to build tomorrow, I must not only believe that I can build tomorrow, I must have control over the bricks, and indeed all the needed materials. Thus, effective planning is possible only if there's collective control over the means. So that's the argument from socialism through caring solidarity to planning and control kind of introduced. Before turning to ownership, let me just say a word about means of production and how we're kind of understanding that. We've said that care involves planning with the resources broadly construed that are used to meet one another's needs. Now, we think those resources are the means of production. These resources might meet a personal need directly, or might need to meet needs, our own or someone else's. To elaborate on the latter, insofar as we care about another person meeting needs, what we do is we empower them with what they need to meet the relevant needs. What we empower them with, the resources we provide them with, are the means of production. So meeting the needs of others, in those cases, involves providing them with the means of production they need to meet the needs of others. Insofar as we're collectively engaged in a process of meeting one another's needs, that's the kind of internal end of solidary socialist activity, the resources we collectively employ in doing so are the means of production. This is just a kind of stipulated definition. The means of production are whatever resources we might use to empower needs meeting. That'll include everything we need to meet one another's needs: raw materials, physical and technological infrastructures, the mental and physical abilities we exercise in production, along with all the laptops, high-vis jackets, stethoscopes we need. It'll also include resources for a range of needs in non-professional contexts, including care and support of the young, infirm, and elderly. Since we understand needs in an expansive way, corresponding to the broad range of activities that can constitute our flourishing, it also follows that what counts as means of production will be quite broad. At the same time, since the means of production have a definite end, namely to empower needs meeting, they won't extend to resources that clearly don't meet needs. So resources that are required to produce chemical weapons or useless consumer goods will not count, for example. And we think that this is the right result. Now, in caring solidarity, one of the things we're planning together is how to sustain this very activity. planning in part how to assign the resources we need to sustain a particular way of life. This requires us to plan which needs should be met, when those needs should be met, how those needs should be met, by whom those needs should be met. Planning what strategy to use in meeting needs is planning what resources and abilities, materials, technologies, and so on to use, and planning how to use those resources. So that's a kind of collective planning of the means of production. Collective planning, however, doesn't entail central command economics. So remember, this is a kind of fractal ideal. Caring solidarity is scalable, it's realized ideally in any relationship across society. It enjoins the shared management of needs at lots of different scales. Rather than a presumption of collectivism, there's a presumption of subsidiarity, with power located as close to need management as possible. This is also not an anarchistic model or a kind of libertarian municipalism. This isn't an anti-state approach. Some centralized management likely is also desirable in any socialist mode of organization in contexts broadly like ours. Many different agencies will likely have control over different aspects of production, workers themselves, surrounding communities, attending to relevant externalities and cultural issues and so on. And of course, consumers. The main point is that control over production isn't just a matter of individual producers having more authority to decide how to do their job. It's a matter of everyone in the economy having more power in consumption, production, and collaborative capacities. Plausibly, constitutional commitments, basic political infrastructure, are themselves to be understood in a kind of plan-based way. There's sort of plan-based theories of law and so on. These plan-based social structures, ideally, we think, are managed collaboratively. Planning extends outward socially and modally, giving greater stability and resourcefulness across all sorts of domains of social life. Okay, so now to say a word about the move from collective control to collective ownership. So collective control is a socio-psychological economic category. Property is a deontic category concerning norms governing the use and transfer of resources. Ownership is a juridical deontic category concerning legally protected property rights. And I'm not going to mark any more significant difference between property and ownership. The key contrast is between control, which is socio-psychological, and ownership, which is deontic. Now, ownership structures facilitate or inhibit different socioeconomic structures in more or less successful ways. Ownership structures facilitate or inhibit different socioeconomic structures in more or less successful ways. There's a wide variety of different kinds of ownership structures, varying in the claims, liberties, and powers that ownership confers over different kinds of resources in different contexts and with different kinds of constraints. So our strategy is first to argue that negatively, private property is incompatible with collective control, before positively making the case that collective property or collective ownership would be compatible with collective control. By private ownership, we have in mind a juridical deontic status that yields entitlements to use and transfer goods at an individual owner's discretion. So there's a kind of list on the second page of the handout, drawn very directly from Steiner and Suter and Valentine's paper 20 odd years ago. So there's sort of 5 key features to private ownership: control rights over the use of an object, rights to compensation if someone uses the object without one's permission, enforcement rights to prevent violation of these rights or extract compensation owed for past violation, rights to transfer these rights to others by sale, rental, gift, or loan, and immunity to non-consensual loss of any of these rights of ownership. So that's not to say, obviously, that a system of private ownership makes one's discretion absolute. In a market-based system, one's choices will often be constrained in lots of ways. Workers own their labor power but are effectively forced to sell it a lot of the time. Similarly, capitalist firms' abilities to act as they please is severely constrained by competition with other firms and the need to make a profit. A manager can choose to close a factory or keep it open, but in as far as they want to keep it open and thriving, the choices available to them will be strategically restricted. So why is private ownership incompatible with caring solidarity? We think private ownership is designed to support discretionary control over resources and to enable the accumulation of resources by way of the entitlement to generate income from them. So set aside the obvious point that production for profit doesn't do a very good job of meeting everyone's needs. The key point is that private ownership is inconsistent with the kind of robust collective control that's necessary for collective planning. So to see why, suppose that the owner of a steel factory delegates control of the factory to their workers who run it on their behalf. It might be thought that the workers then exercise collective control over the factory, thereby making collective planning possible. But this isn't so. For one thing, the owner can always take control back. And given the owner has the discretion to do that as well, the workers' plans about what to produce, how to produce, and what quantities and by whom will naturally be shaped by the constraint of not upsetting the owner. And that will usually mean making sure the owner gets a good return on their investment. Even if the owner doesn't exercise their right to take back control, their power to exercise that right is sufficient to limit the collective control that our workers own over their production. And so for the behavior of other private capitalists whose decisions strategically will affect will constitute constraints on even what the owner of their firm could choose to do. So now to collective ownership, this differs not just in the agent that has ownership. So the difference between private and collective ownership isn't just a difference in whether the same ownership model is held by individuals or by collectivities. This is also a difference in the kind of ownership and the specific incidents associated with ownership. So we suggest, and again, this is on the handout, collective ownership involves teleologically specified control rights. So protected empowerments, effectively. Teleologically specified control rights over the use of the object to meet specific needs as so empowered, as best one can. No rights to compensation if someone uses the object without one's permission as a suitable way to participate in socialist production. Enforcement rights contextually defined. No automatic rights to transfer these resources to others. And individual control over productive resources can be deauthorized if those resources are sufficiently underutilized and scarce. So underutilized fertile agricultural land, complex scientific equipment, or individual workspace can be reassigned if the worker isn't using it productively. As it often will be. We've argued that living in caring solidarity would involve planning to build and sustain socialist activities on multiple levels. This will include building and sustaining deontic structures that would support and facilitate living up to the ideal. Hence, it's not a coincidence, that's sort of analogous to the point that you would build constitutions that would sustain the ideal. Hence, it's not a coincidence or merely a matter of empirical contingency that a collective ownership model supports and facilitates collective management, planning, and control. Rather, collective ownership is the category of models of ownership that we would build and sustain precisely in order to support and facilitate collective planning and control. In fact, to take this point one step further, not only is it the case that we design a model of ownership to enable and secure models of desirable control, but creating and sustaining collective ownership will be part of collectively controlling production. Hence, it would be partly constitutive of caring solidarity that it involved building and sustaining collective ownership of the means of production. So just to conclude the argument, it may be helpful to say something about the metaphysical status of the argument. The relationship between caring solidarity and collaborative planning and control is metaphysically constitutive. The definitions of the various constituents of caring solidarity entail, they metaphysically necessitate that in caring solidarity there will be collaborative control over the means of production. There's no such metaphysical entailment from collective control to collective ownership, since the ideal of caring solidarity is a democratic ideal, one in which people collectively make decisions about a wide range of political, economic, and juridical matters. Rather, the argument is a normative one, that collaborators in caring solidarity would opt for whichever system of property rights would empower us to live in caring solidarity. This would be a system of property rights that reflected and supported the structures of control in a collaborative division of labour. However, I do think this would be an a priori argument. So in as much as it's kind of democratic argument about what we would control, it's a priori given the kind of level of abstraction of all of the relevant concepts. So this argument for principles that would be accepted given standards of reasoning is, I think, methodologically familiar from Rawls's argument from the original position. For reasons given, private ownership would not be chosen by collaborators in caring solidarity. Collective ownership, or more specifically, a system of ownership that reflects our responsibilities in caring solidarity, would be so chosen. So this completes the argument from ownership to caring solidarity to caring ownership. And there's a summary of the argument on the back of on the second page of the handout. Just for interest of time, I'll let you poke holes in that at your leisure, and I'll just move on to talking about some other objections. So there's kind of two obvious objections. I mean, it's probably, I don't know if objections is the right word, but kinds of worries that one will naturally arise with views of this kind. So the first is, can't we enjoy the advantages of markets, the kind of motivational and epistemic advantages of markets, while also realizing the ideal of caring solidarity, perhaps with sufficiently robust predistribution and redistribution, and kind of twiddling with the markets in the right way. So we think not. So for one thing, unlike ownership instrumentalisms, we think caring solidarity is a thick social structure with motivational implications. It's itself an ideal social structure. That social structure partly is constituted by certain ways of relating to one another, have motivational implications for planning and so on. In other work, I have previously argued that these relationships are incompatible with living up to the ideals of efficient market participation. This is a paper from a few years ago. To get the efficiency benefits that defenders of markets say that markets provide, people have to respond to the imperative to maximize profit. And this will often require us to treat others in uncaring ways. I kind of argue that that's a priori true, and that's a kind of limitation on the range of relationships compatible with markets that enjoy the kind of efficiency benefits that are presented as arguments for them. That seems like a reasonable argument to me still, and it seems to make sense of Jerry Cohen's concern about how his father was treated. Cohen said, the capitalist market doesn't, of course, require people to handle people roughly, but the market does require people to handle people, to manage them in a particular sense. His father, Maury, was dismissed because it no longer paid his boss to pay him. So that's kind of one worry. But today I want to emphasize a different line of reply. Given the very opacity of the invisible hand, huge swathes of choices will be made by the market system rather than by the people affected by these choices, or by capitalists. As Chiara Cordelli put it, markets involve an awful lot of rule by none. Here, I think we need to draw a distinction between two types of control. In the scenario envisaged in the objection, we have control over the establishment of this. So in the kind of ideal market socialist model, we have control over the establishment of this huge invisible hand system, but the control that's exercised within it is the highly artificial context of specific choices about what and whether to exchange. These choices themselves are often severely restricted. I own my labor power, but I must sell it to support myself and my family. You own your firm, but market competition means you have to replace your workforce with robots or whatever. As producers, consumers, and third parties, the market gives us very little mid-sized control over the nature and quality of products, production processes, and associated externalities. But most of production is mid-sized. And so our modest conjecture is that as time goes on, it'll be increasingly difficult to see ourselves as collectively involved in relations of caring solidarity. The very infrastructure is incompatible with the kind of ideal, the notion of recognition that's built into the ideal. But at this point, consider another objection, a kind of natural reply from a market socialist. Take the case of Jerry Cohen's dad, Maury Cohen. If the market suggests that Maury Cohen's job should be terminated, he's not actually contributing to the good of others. The marginal cost of keeping him employed is higher than the marginal benefit. It would be uncaring not to accept that his work in this particular context is wasteful. I think Harrison Fry pushed that line on us in a previous context. But even in the best case scenario, there's a decent chance that in any particular instance of not serving someone, of firing somebody, reducing their wages or his benefits, there's a decent chance that doing so will not be for the best. The argument for markets is an indirect argument. It's like, this is best overall. It doesn't tell you necessarily about the particular situation. But even if it is in the best, for the best in this particular case, it seems unlikely the agent will know this is true, partly because they understand that the argument is an indirect one. And even if they do know that it's true, they won't know why. That's the opacity point. It's incompatible with the counterfactually robust notion of control that we have in mind. At best, one would know the abstract fact, the abstract indirect fact, that doing what the market tells you is the best, most efficient use of resources across a massive system. In the absolute best case scenario for a market socialist, that's the most that you can know through the market. Asking someone to be directly motivated to accept a huge personal sacrifice like losing one's job, for which many people like Maury Cohen is more than a source of income, on the basis of this very abstract property, is very demanding. And this demandingness is all the more problematic given that under market socialism, one simultaneously enjoyed to pursue one's self-interest to get the alleged benefits of markets. You're kind of given the responsibility to meet your own needs through using your own income and exchanging it for goods in the market. So this market-based system that we're envisaging, we think involves a kind of moral schizophrenia. Even if I really care about employees, I must lay them off. Even if I really care about my customers, I must try and profit at their expense. Even if I really care about producers, I must try and get their service for the lowest possible cost. The market socialist response relies on an unstable amalgam of self-interest and extreme social sacrifice, even in the best case scenario. In caring solidarity, by contrast, there's a much greater congruence between the content of our first order and collective ends and everything all the way up and down. I play my part in a larger activity of caring solidarity precisely by caring about you. And I'm transparently empowered to do so. Of course, this doesn't settle the case against markets. It merely supports the claim that there's a deep tension between markets and caring solidarity. So even if it turns out that we can't do without markets, it would still follow, in our view, that organizing economic activity by way of markets would involve a considerable loss of value. This represents a contrast with egalitarian and other market socialist defenders, for whom the question of whether to organize with markets is of merely instrumental interest. Finally, romantic anti-capitalism. Might be objected that we've underappreciated the realities of modern large-scale production, which involves a complex division of labour. Our view may be thought to be a version of what David Miller called romantic anti-capitalism. The question here is whether our emphasis on caring solidarity is only feasible for the medieval village and not for our contemporary global economy. I think not. I realise I'm starting perhaps speaking a bit too long, so I'll just kind of point to the 2 lines of reply, and people can ask me in Q&A if they want more information. The first is that the ideal is fractal. Socialism, I think, can be realised at every degree, and it doesn't turn on its full realisation at the level of the basic structure. And so I think it can, like I'm working with parts of public health to try and restructure workforce models, and I think community wealth building is a way of kind of realising some parts of this ideal. And so I think that there's quite a lot that can be done in different contexts to try and improve things and try and bring them into alignment with this ideal to a greater extent. And secondly, I think that there is going to be a division of labour across scales, so that there will be some work to be done, and not merely locally. It's not merely it's not a kind of anarchistic model. That there will be work for the state. Maybe I'll just conclude by pointing out or reiterating that, unlike ownership fundamentalism, we're not arguing that collective ownership and control is a value in and of itself, or we're not arguing that collective ownership is a value in and of itself. In our view, collective ownership is valuable only because it's sort of suited to a certain way of organizing society together. But unlike ownership instrumentalists, in our view, the relationship between socialism and planning and control and ownership isn't merely empirical or one for further economic investigation. It's partly constitutive of the socialist relationship, that it involves effective planning and control, and that it would involve collective ownership. Thus, we hope to try and rehabilitate and vindicate the old socialist commitment to collective control and ownership, but without fetishizing property relations. Anyway, that's what we've got for today. Really looking forward to hearing what some of you think. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Barry. I'm just going to stop recording so that we move to